The deep court of the Sea Kingdom existed in eternal twilight, where bioluminescent architecture cast shadows that revealed as much as they concealed, its crystalline spires reaching toward surface waters that few inhabitants would ever see, while housing power structure that governed oceanic realm through authority, that extended from abyssal trenches to territorial boundaries, where surface world began according to treaties that maintained separation between civilizations whose contact remained carefully regulated, despite mutual dependence upon planetary systems that connected all waters. Within this realm of controlled beauty and regulated hierarchy, Selene had learned survival through invisibility that protected lesser merfolk from attention that rarely proved beneficial when directed toward those whose social position offered no protection against aristocratic whims that could transform individual existence into object lesson about appropriate deference to established authority, through demonstrations that served collective education rather than individual justice. Her quarters occupied section of palace reserved for minor attendants, whose service supported royal household without warranting recognition, beyond functional acknowledgement of competence that enabled continued employment in position that provided security through useful anonymity rather than advancement that attracted notice from those whose interest often proved dangerous for recipients unprepared. Read to navigate political complexities that court life imposed upon all participants. 23 years of careful observation had taught her which corridors to avoid during periods when certain nobles conducted business that required privacy, which conversations to ignore despite accidentally overhearing information that could prove valuable if shared with appropriate recipients, and which questions never to ask, regardless of curiosity that natural intelligence generated about CIE. Circumstances that official explanations failed to address adequately through conventional diplomatic language. The palace itself reflected oceanic civilization's mastery of organic architecture that worked with natural forces rather than imposing geometric authority upon aquatic environment, its living walls responding to inhabitant needs while maintaining structural integrity through harmonic resonance that created beauty alongside functionality, according to aesthetic principles that celebrated cooperating on between consciousness and nature rather than domination of one over other. Corridors flowed like currents that guided movement while providing choice about direction and destination, their surfaces decorated with patterns that shifted according to light conditions and seasonal cycles in ways that prevented monotony, while supporting navigation through familiarity that grew over time, rather than requiring memorization of static landmarks, that mechanical architecture typic. Ally employed for organizational purposes. Gardens of coral and kelp created spaces for contemplation, while supporting ecosystem that contributed to palace environmental health through biological processes that maintained water quality alongside providing habitat for creatures whose presence enhanced both beauty and practical function, according to design principles that recognized interdependence as foundation for sustainable civilization. The royal chambers occupied central position that balanced accessibility with security through architectural arrangements that allowed privacy while maintaining connection to broader palace community, whose welfare remained ultimate responsibility of monarchy that served collective interest through individual dedication to principles that honored both personal autonomy and social obligation accord. To oceanic law that had evolved through millennia of experience with governance challenges. But despite architectural beauty and theoretical justice that oceanic civilization had achieved through careful development of legal and social institutions, practical reality often differed from ideal aspirations when individual behavior expressed personal prejudices and private agendas that official policy could not always prevent or punish effectively, despite comprehensive attempts to regulate. Interaction between different social levels through clearly defined protocols and enforcement mechanisms. For Selene, survival required constant awareness of dangers that invisibility could not always prevent, despite careful attention to appropriate behavior that should have provided protection through compliance with established expectations about proper conduct for those whose position demanded deference without guaranteeing safety, from those who interpreted authority as license for behavior that official justice would condemn if circumstances permitted proper investigation and punishment. The expedition assignment that would transform her careful existence into catalyst for violence she had never anticipated or desired had arrived through normal administrative channels that distributed routine responsibilities among qualified personnel, without suggesting exceptional danger beyond standard risks that oceanic travel always presented through environmental hazards and occasional encounters with hostile creatures whose territorial instincts created challenges for peaceful passage. Diplomatic Survey of Northern Territories. The assignment document had specified with language that suggested routine inspection of border regions, where oceanic authority required periodic confirmation through official presence that demonstrated continued administrative attention to areas whose distance from central authority sometimes encouraged independence that needed gentle correction through a visible reminder of royal oversight rather than enforcement action that could create unnecessary tension. Educational opportunity for junior staff to observe administrative procedures while contributing practical assistance that expedition efficiency requires. The document had continued with description that emphasized learning experience alongside useful service that justified inclusion of personnel whose primary qualification remained willingness to participate rather than essential expertise critical missions would demand. Such assignments typically proceeded without incident through established protocols that minimized risk, while maximizing educational value for participants whose future service could benefit from exposure to routine administrative functions that domestic palace duties did not provide. Despite comprehensive training in theoretical aspects of oceanic governance and diplomatic procedures that textbook case study could not fully convey. But this expedition would prove different, despite routine appearance that careful planning had created, through attention to normal safety procedures and personnel selection that emphasized compatibility and competence rather than political considerations that more sensitive missions required through careful evaluation of participant loyalty and discretion regarding information that unauthorized disclosure could compromise for strategic disadvantage. Tonight, as preparation for departure continued through final equipment checks and briefing sessions that addressed expected challenges, alongside contingency procedures for various emergency scenarios that experience had identified as potential complications, circumstances were arranging encounter that would reveal how quickly routine mission could transform into personal nightmare that challenge. Every assumption about safety, justice, and appropriate response to cruelty, that power often concealed behind veneer of legitimate authority. The quiet mermaid who had survived through careful invisibility would discover that some attention could not be avoided regardless of precaution, while learning whether oceanic justice could recognize authentic injury, despite social barriers that often prevented truth from reaching those whose authority could provide appropriate response, when circumstances demanded intervention that transcended normal administrative procedures through recognition that individual suffering required personal attention from highest levels of governmental authority. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The holding chamber beneath the palace had been designed for temporary containment rather than punishment, its modest dimensions and basic amenities reflecting oceanic justice system's emphasis on rehabilitation over retribution, while providing secure environment for those whose circumstances required official evaluation before appropriate response could be determined through careful consideration of evidence and testimony that due process demanded. Celine floated in corner farthest from entrance where shadows provided psychological comfort, despite transparent walls that made genuine concealment impossible. Her injuries creating pain that magical healing could address, but which emotional trauma complicated through stress responses that interfered with natural recovery processes that oceanic physiology typically employed for rapid restoration of physical wellness following accidental damage. The bruising along her ribs and arms told story of violence that official reports had attributed to navigational accident during stormy conditions, with language that suggested environmental hazards rather than deliberate assault, despite patterns that medical examination would reveal as inconsistent with wave action or collision with natural obstacles that expedition documentation claimed had used injuries requiring immediate medical attention. Blood still seeped from lacerations that defensive movements had created when attempting to protect herself from attacks that careful positioning had failed to prevent, despite years of experience in avoiding confrontation through strategic withdrawal from situations where conflict seemed likely to develop beyond verbal disagreement toward physical expression of dominance that certain personality employed for establishing social hierarchy through intimidation. Her escort, 3 guards assigned for protection during expedition that had supposedly suffered casualties through same environmental hazards that had injured her, would never provide testimony about actual events that had transformed routine diplomatic mission into exercise in cruelty, that official investigation would struggle to reconstruct without witness accounts that survivors seemed reluctant to provide through detailed statements. "They're saying you broke regulations," whispered voice from adjacent chamber, where another detainee awaited administrative review of circumstances that had resulted in temporary containment, while officials determined appropriate response to reported violations that required careful evaluation before final disposition could be decided through formal hearing process. "What regulations?" Celine asked with genuine confusion about accusations that investigation had not yet clarified, despite obvious importance for understanding charges that detention implied were being considered against her through administrative process that due process required, but which preliminary information suggested might prove difficult to defend against, without legal representation, that her social positio, and could not afford. "Unauthorized departure from designated route," the voice replied with information that someone had shared despite official instructions that detainees should avoid discussion of pending cases that could influence testimony or create coordination between participants whose individual statements needed to remain independent for investigative integrity that proper evaluation demanded. "Abandonment of assigned escort without permission from expedition leadership," continued the unknown informant with additional details that suggested accusations were being prepared through administrative process that would require formal response despite apparent inconsistency with circumstances that anyone familiar with expedition protocols would recognize as impossible for junior participant to initiate unilaterally. "Failure to report safety concerns through proper channels before situation deteriorated beyond management capability," concluded the list with charge that seemed designed to place responsibility for expedition failure upon individual whose position provided no authority for making decisions that such accusation implied. She should have initiated through leadership that circumstances had made unavailable for consultation. "Those charges make no sense," Cellini protested with recognition that accusations contradicted basic facts about expedition hierarchy and decision-making authority that anyone familiar with administrative procedures would understand, despite apparent attempt to construct narrative that placed blame upon convenient target rather than investigating actual causes of mission failure. "Charges don't have to make sense if no one contradicts them," came reply that revealed cynical understanding of justice system that could function according to political convenience rather than factual accuracy when circumstances created pressure for rapid resolution. That thorough investigation might complicate through inconvenient discoveries about responsibility and causation. But surely investigation will reveal what actually happened during expedition. She argued with faith in institutional integrity. That experience should have taught her to question, despite theoretical commitment to justice, that official policy proclaimed through formal procedures that actual practice did not always honor when expedience served administrative convenience better than truth. "Investigation will reveal what investigators are told to find," her fellow detainee replied, with knowledge that suggested personal experience with judicial process, whose outcomes could be predetermined through political considerations that transcended factual evidence when circumstances created pressure for specific conclusions that served broader institutional interests. The conversation ceased abruptly as footsteps approached with rhythm that suggested official business rather than routine patrol, their measured pace indicating formal procedure that detainee interaction needed to avoid disrupting through appearance of coordination that could influence investigation, despite innocent nature of communication that circumstances had encouraged through shared uncertainty and tie about charges and process. "Celine of the Lower Gardens," announced voice that carried authority suggesting high administrative rank, despite unfamiliarity, that prevented immediate identification of speaker, whose presence indicated elevation of her case beyond routine processing, that normal violations typically receive through standard administrative channels, rather than personal attention from senior officials. "Yes," she replied with acknowledgement that avoided any assumption about appropriate protocol for responding to official inquiry, whose purpose remained unclear despite obvious importance that high-ranking attention suggested for circumstances that she had hoped would receive minimal notice through quiet resolution that protected reputation while addressing whatever administrative concerns expedition failure had created. "You will accompany me for interview regarding recent events that require clarification," the official continued with instruction that admitted no possibility of refusal, despite polite language that maintained appearance of voluntary cooperation, rather than compulsory compliance with investigation, that legal framework demanded regardless of personal preference about participation. "Interview with whom?" Celine asked, with need for understanding about process that could affect her future, despite obvious requirement to comply with official request that carried implicit authority for enforcement if cooperation was not provided willingly through recognition of legitimate administrative necessity for information gathering. Interview that will proceed according to established protocol for cases requiring high-level review, came response that avoided direct answer, while providing sufficient information to indicate exceptional treatment that suggested either unusual complexity or political sensitivity that normal procedures could not adequately address through routine channels. As escort led her through corridors she had never seen despite years of palace residence, architectural details revealed increasing proximity to central authority through decorative elements and structural features that marked areas reserved for highest levels of governmental function, where access required specific authorization that her normal duties never provided, despite comprehensive knowledge of palace layout in sections appropriate for her position. "Where are we going?" she asked with growing anxiety about destination. That corridor design suggested approached royal chambers, whose proximity her social position should never permit, despite official business that might justify temporary access to areas normally restricted to those whose rank warranted presence near center of oceanic governmental authority. "Evaluation requires environment appropriate for sensitive discussion," her escort replied with explanation that suggested interview would address information requiring discretion that normal administrative offices could not provide through security arrangements and privacy protection that high-level investigation demanded when circumstances involved potential threats to palace security or social stability. The corridor terminated at entrance, whose design marked it as threshold to royal territory, where protocol demanded behavior that her experience had never required, despite theoretical knowledge about appropriate conduct in presence of highest authority that oceanic society recognized through institutional arrangements that placed ultimate responsibility for realm welfare upon monarchy that served collective interest through individual dedication to principles of justice and protection. "His Majesty wishes to speak with you personally," the escort announced with information that sent shock through understanding that had never contemplated direct contact with royal authority, whose attention typically remained focused upon matters of realm-wide importance rather than individual circumstances that administrative hierarchy should handle through established procedures that prevented unnecessary burden upon monarchical time and energy. "His Majesty?" Celine repeated with disbelief that individual case could warrant personal attention from Sea King, whose responsibilities included governance of entire oceanic realm through decisions that affected millions of subjects, whose welfare required constant attention to policy implementation and diplomatic relationships that maintained peaceful cooperation between various territorial regions. "Protocol requires immediate compliance with royal request for interview," the escort emphasized, with reminder that monarchical authority admitted no possibility of delay or negotiation about timing, despite personal anxiety that such unprecedented attention naturally created through recognition of power, differential that made outcome entirely dependent upon royal judgment rather than established oil. Egal procedures. The chamber beyond threshold revealed environment designed for private consultation rather than formal audience, its comfortable arrangement suggesting conversation rather than official hearing despite obvious importance that royal attention indicated for circumstances that had somehow attracted notice from highest level of oceanic authority. Despite routine nature, that expedition assignment should have maintained throughout its execution. King Nerion rose from contemplation of documents whose content suggested extensive investigation had already begun, despite recent nature of events that normal administrative response would still be organizing through preliminary fact-gathering, that precedent established as first step in evaluation process, that proper procedure demanded before reaching conclusions about responsibility or appropriate. 8. Response to reported violations. "Your Majesty," Celine said with formal acknowledgement, that protocol demanded, despite complete unfamiliarity with appropriate behavior for direct interaction with royal authority, whose presence created anxiety that made coherent thought difficult, despite obvious necessity for careful attention to proper respect and deference that such encounter required through established customs. "Please be comfortable," he replied with gentleness that contradicted expectations about monarchical authority, while suggesting interview would proceed according to principles that prioritized understanding over enforcement, despite obvious power differential that made her position entirely dependent upon royal judgment, about circumstances that investigation had apparently elevated beyond normal A. Administrative processing. I understand recent events have been traumatic. King Nerion continued with observation that encompassed both physical evidence of injury and psychological impact that circumstances had created through experiences that official reports had clearly failed to describe accurately, despite administrative obligation to provide truthful account of expedition circumstances that had resulted in casualty, and accusations requiring high-level attention. Yes, Your Majesty, she acknowledged with confirmation that avoided specific detail about events that memory made painful to recall, despite obvious necessity for truthful testimony, that investigation required through royal inquiry, that personal attention made both more important and more dangerous than routine administrative interview about reported violations. Then perhaps you would help me understand what actually occurred during expedition that resulted in your injuries and the loss of your escort, he requested with invitation for testimony. That respectful tone encouraged despite awareness that royal authority could compel response regardless of personal willingness to provide information that memory made difficult to recall without emotional distress. Looking into royal eyes that reflected genuine concern alongside unmistakable authority, Celine recognized moment that would determine whether truth could overcome official narrative that circumstances had apparently created through reports that bore little resemblance to actual events she had experienced despite obvious importance of accurate information for investigation, that royal attention in Dicated would proceed according to standards that demanded factual, rather than convenient conclusions about responsibility and causation. The question hung in water between them like choice, that would affect not only individual welfare, but broader understanding of justice and protection that oceanic civilization claimed to provide for all citizens, regardless of social position through institutional arrangements that theory proclaimed, but practice did not always honor when circumstances created pressure for expedient rather than autai. Hentic resolution of conflicts between different versions of truth, that power typically determined through authority rather than evidence. The Sea King's expression shifted with understanding that encompassed both recognition of supernatural phenomena and immediate awareness of implications that such revelation created for comprehension of events that official reports had attempted to explain through conventional causes, despite evidence that suggested forces beyond normal oceanic activity had intervened during circumstances that transformed routine expedition into demonstration of powers that few individuals possessed, through connection with elemental forces that responded to authentic suffering with protective violence. The sea responded, King Nerion repeated, with tone that balanced acknowledgement of possibility against need for detail, that proper evaluation required through understanding of exactly what oceanic intervention had encompassed during assault that had apparently triggered supernatural assistance, despite victims' ignorance about capabilities that bloodline or exceptional circumstance might have activated through emotional extremity that ordinary consciousness could not access. How did such response manifest during circumstances that required immediate intervention? He asked with question that requested specific information about phenomena that magical investigation would need to understand, through documentation that established facts, rather than relying upon speculation about forces whose operation required empirical evidence for accurate assessment of capabilities and their implications for broader oceanic society. Water temperature dropped suddenly. Celine replied with initial observation that physical senses had registered despite circumstances that made careful attention to environmental changes, difficult through concentration, required for survival against assault, that demanded focus upon immediate threats rather than atmospheric phenomena, that background awareness might normally have noted. Cold enough to affect movement and coordination of attackers despite oceanic physiology that normally provides protection against temperature variations that should not influence combat capability. She continued with detail that suggested supernatural, rather than natural cooling, through effects that exceeded environmental parameters that normal oceanic conditions could produce even during extreme weather events. Currents began moving against normal patterns, she added, with observation that training in oceanic ecology had made recognizable despite crisis circumstances that challenged analytical thought through survival instincts that prioritized immediate response over scientific assessment of unusual phenomena that subsequent reflection had identified as significant for understanding intervention. Moving how? King Nerion asked, with question that sought technical detail about oceanic behavior that magical investigation would require for determining whether supernatural forces had indeed responded through manipulation of natural elements, that conscious direction rather than random environmental variation had coordinated according to protective purpose that victim welfare had apparently triggered. Circular patterns that created barriers between myself and attackers while simultaneously generating pressure that interfered with their coordination, Celine explained, with description of phenomena that suggested intelligent design, rather than coincidental environmental activity, despite apparent impossibility, that individual could have directed such complex oceanic manipulation without conscious intent or magical training, as though water itself had become participant rather than merely environment for conflict that concerned only those directly involved in assault. She continued with interpretation that revealed understanding of supernatural intervention, despite lack of experience with magical forces, that such recognition typically required through education or previous exposure to phenomena that exceeded natura. Explanation. Pressure that affected attackers specifically rather than creating general environmental changes that would have influenced all participants equally? The Sea King prompted with question that distinguished between random oceanic disturbance and directed intervention that suggested conscious manipulation of forces according to protective intent rather than coincidental environmental variation that circumstances might have produced. Commander Thane and his supporters struggled against currents that seemed designed to immobilize them, while water around me remained calm enough to permit movement that escape required. Celine confirmed with testimony that established selective application of oceanic forces that conscious direction rather than environmental accident had coordinated according to protective purpose. Furthermore, she continued with additional detail that memory had attempted to suppress despite significance for understanding intervention that had preserved her life. Marine predators appeared with timing that suggested response to summons rather than coincidental presence in territory, that normal behavior patterns would not have brought them during circumstances that created opportunity for feeding. Predators responding to supernatural call rather than natural stimuli such as blood or disturbance that might have attracted attention through normal hunting instincts? King Nerion asked with question that sought clarification about marine animal behavior, that distinguished between natural predator response and magical compulsion that directed creatures according to protective purpose, that individual welfare had triggered. Sharks arriving in coordinated formation rather than individual hunting patterns, she replied, with observation that marine biology training had made recognizable despite circumstances that challenged scientific assessment through emotional stress that crisis had created alongside physical demands that survival had required, through resistance and eventual escape from isolation. Behavior that suggested organized response to command rather than opportunistic feeding, that blood and violence typically attracted through normal predatory instincts. She added with interpretation that distinguished between natural animal behavior and supernatural coordination that conscious direction had provided according to protective intent, that circumstances had activated through connecti. She did not understand. And the outcome of such intervention for those who had assaulted you? The Sea King asked with question, that requested information about consequences that supernatural assistance had created for perpetrators whose fate official reports had attributed to environmental hazards, rather than acknowledging oceanic forces that protective purpose had directed against those whose behavior had triggered intervention. By dawn, Celine whispered, with voice that carried horror alongside relief at survival that supernatural assistance had provided through violence she had never intended to cause, despite gratitude for protection that circumstances had demanded when institutional safeguards had failed through systematic preparation that had removed witnesses and formal protection. Half the expedition was dead, killed by predators that normal territorial behavior would not have motivated toward such aggressive assault upon oceanic inhabitants, whose presence should have triggered avoidance rather than attack. King Nerion asked with question, that sought confirmation of supernatural rather than natural causation for deaths that investigation would need to explain, through evidence that supported magical intervention rather than environmental accident. Sharks that ignored normal feeding patterns to focus specifically upon those who had participated in assault, while avoiding expedition members whose behavior had remained professional, she confirmed with testimony that established selective violence that conscious direction rather than random predation had coordinated according to moral judgment that distinguished between perpetrators and participants. Evidence that suggested oceanic forces had evaluated individual character before directing protective violence against specific targets, rather than creating general environmental hazard that affected all participants equally. She continued with interpretation that revealed understanding of supernatural justice, that individual connection had apparently activated despite lack of conscious intent, to summon assistance that circumstances had provided. Survivors reported environmental disaster that investigation accepted, despite inconsistency with known territorial hazards and predator behavior patterns that established science had documented through generations of oceanic study. She added, with information about official response that had chosen conventional explanation over acknowledgement of supernatural phenomena, that evidence clearly supposed. And your own understanding of events that had transformed routine expedition into demonstration of oceanic power responding to individual suffering? The Sea King asked, with question that requested personal assessment of capabilities that bloodline or exceptional circumstance had revealed through crisis that had activated forces beyond normal individual control or conscious direction. I never intended such violence, Celine replied, with disclaimer that emphasized lack of conscious intent to harm others, despite grateful recognition that supernatural intervention had preserved her life through protection that institutional safeguards had failed to provide when systematic preparation had created vulnerability, that assault had exploited through removal of witnesses and formal security. But oceanic forces responded to authentic suffering through protective violence that distinguished between perpetrator and victim, according to moral judgment that individual consciousness had not requested, but which emotional extremity had apparently triggered. She continued with acknowledgement of phenomena that challenged understanding, while requiring acceptance of capabilities that remained beyond her comprehension or deliberate control. Powers that suggest bloodline connection to oceanic forces that few individuals possess through ancestry that grants access to elemental cooperation during circumstances that require supernatural assistance for survival. King Nerion observed with assessment that revealed recognition of rare capabilities that genetic inheritance occasionally provided through family lines whose oceanic connection exceeded normal individual limitations. Bloodline? Celine asked with confusion, about suggestion that family heritage might include supernatural capabilities that parents had never mentioned, despite obvious relevance for understanding personal identity and potential abilities that proper education could have developed through training. That knowledge of such inheritance would have justified despite social position that discouraged expectations about exceptional capability. Investigation of family records indicates a lineage that includes individuals whose oceanic connection exceeded normal parameters through ancestry that grants access to elemental forces during circumstances that emotional extremity activates, despite conscious ignorance about capabilities that trauma had revealed through protective response that supernatural assistance had provided. The Sea King explained with reference to genealogical research that royal authority had apparently initiated. Records that your parents presumably concealed through concern that such knowledge might create expectations or danger that social position could not support despite heritage, that provided access to powers whose development proper training could have facilitated through education that bloodline warranted regardless of current economic circumstances. He continued with understanding of family decisions that protective secrecy had motivated. But concealment cannot alter inheritance that crisis circumstances have now revealed through oceanic response that distinguished between those deserving protection and those whose behavior warranted supernatural punishment according to moral judgment that elemental forces had exercised through your unconscious connection with powers that bloodline provides. He concluded with assessment that established both identity and responsibility that such capabilities created. Looking into royal eyes that reflected complex mixture of understanding and concern, Celine recognized that rescue from immediate danger had been replaced by different challenges that supernatural revelation created through transformation of individual identity from anonymous victim into person whose capabilities carried implications for oceanic society that extended far beyond personal welfare toward broader questions about power, justice, and appropriate response to suffering that institutional protection had failed to prevent. What happens now? She asked, with awareness that oceanic forces had responded to her pain through violence that she had not consciously directed, but which her supernatural connection had apparently triggered, according to protective instincts that bloodline inheritance had provided despite ignorance about capabilities that circumstances had revealed through crisis requiring intervention that normal assistance could not have supplied. Now we address broader implications of supernatural response that has demonstrated oceanic forces will intervene directly when institutional protection fails those whose suffering activates powers that few individuals possess through bloodline connection to elemental cooperation. King Nerion replied with recognition that individual case had revealed systemic problems requiring comprehensive response that extended beyond personal justice toward institutional reform. Justice that acknowledges both immediate crimes requiring punishment and broader failures of protection that supernatural intervention had to address when formal safeguards proved inadequate. He continued with framework that encompassed individual accountability, alongside systemic improvement that oceanic society needed to implement through recognition that exceptional circumstances revealed no normal inadequacies requiring comprehensive attention, and recognition that bloodline inheritance carries responsibilities alongside capabilities that proper education must develop through training that prepares individuals for roles that supernatural connection might require during circumstances that test institutional effectiveness against individual need for protection that all citizens deserve regardless of social position. He concluded with understanding that transformation from victim to person of power created obligations that both individual and society needed to address through careful preparation for future challenges. The quiet mermaid who had survived through careful invisibility had discovered that some pain demanded witness from highest authority, while learning that oceanic justice included supernatural forces that responded to authentic suffering through protective violence that transformed individual trauma into catalyst for broader recognition that systematic change was required when institutional protection failed those whose bloodline granted them access to powers that could reshape oceanic society through proper understanding and appropriate development. In chambers where royal authority contemplated implications of supernatural intervention that had revealed both individual capability and institutional inadequacy, circumstances had demonstrated that oceanic forces recognized suffering that formal systems had failed to prevent, while providing protection that transformed victim into agent of change, whose future role would require careful consideration of how exceptional abilities could serve collective welfare through powers that bloodline had granted, for purposes that extended beyond personal survival, toward broader protection of those whose suffering might otherwise remain unheard, by authorities whose responsibility included recognition that individual pain often revealed systemic failures, requiring comprehensive response through institutional reform guided by principles that honored both individual dignity and collective security. 6 months later, the Council Chamber of Deep Waters had been redesigned to accommodate participation from representatives whose voices had previously remained unheard, despite contributions essential for oceanic society's welfare. Its expanded configuration reflecting institutional recognition that effective governance required input from all social levels, rather than maintaining hierarchical isolation that had prevented authentic understanding of challenges that different populations faced through daily experience with policies, whose implementation often differed from original intent. Celine occupied position that balanced her new role as oceanic justice advocate with continued connection to communities whose concerns her background enabled her to understand through personal experience with vulnerability that formal authority rarely encountered directly, despite theoretical commitment to protection that institutional design claimed to provide for all citizens, regardless of social position or bloodline inheritance. Her office maintained simplicity that reflected preference for functional service over ceremonial display, while providing access for those whose need for assistance might be discouraged by intimidating formal atmosphere that traditional governmental architecture often created through emphasis upon hierarchical distance rather than approachable consultation that effective advocacy required through genuine availability for those seeking help. Morning briefings include reports from territorial surveys conducted according to new safety protocols that prevent isolation of individual participants through mandatory witness presence and communication requirements. She announced, while reviewing documentation, that administrative reform had generated through systematic revision of expedition procedures that prevented repetition of circumstance, says that had enabled assault through systematic removal of protection and oversight. All expedition leadership now receives training in recognizing signs of predatory behavior, alongside technical instruction about environmental hazards and territorial management. She continued, with reference to educational programs that comprehensive policy revision had mandated through recognition that character assessment required equal attention with professional competence for positions in vidyas, ulving authority over subordinate personnel whose welfare depended upon appropriate leadership. Furthermore, she added with satisfaction that institutional change had warranted despite personal cost, that revelation of supernatural capabilities had created through transformation of private individual into public figure whose responsibilities extended beyond personal preference toward collective service, that bloodline inheritance had apparently destined through powers, that proper training had begun developing. Victim advocacy protocols ensure that assault survivors receive immediate support through trained counselors whose expertise addresses both practical assistance and emotional recovery that trauma typically requires. Her assistant, Kira of the Western Reaches, had proven invaluable for managing administrative complexity that expanded role created while providing perspective from different territorial background that enhanced understanding of diverse challenges that oceanic society encompassed through geographical and cultural variation that central authority needed to acknowledge through inclusive representation rather than assuming uniform experience across all populations. Council agenda includes review of proposed legislation establishing oceanic protection courts with jurisdiction specifically designed for addressing assault cases through procedures that prioritize victim welfare alongside appropriate punishment for perpetrators whose behavior threatens social stability. Kira reported with reference to legal innovation that institutional reform had motivated the rough recognition that existing judicial system had not adequately addressed crimes involving power differential and social vulnerability. Specialized courts staffed by judges trained in understanding trauma impact alongside legal precedent. Celine observed with approval for judicial development that balanced punishment with rehabilitation, while ensuring that victim testimony received appropriate consideration, despite emotional difficulty that such proceedings typically created through requirement to relive painful experiences for evidentiary purposes. Monthly statistics indicate significant reduction in reported expedition incidents since implementation of new safety protocols. Kira continued, with evidence that systematic reform had achieved practical improvement in personnel protection, through recognition that environmental hazards provided convenient cover for assault, that proper oversight could prevent through mandatory witness presence and communication requirements that isolated abuse impossible. Though increased reporting suggests that previous incidents were systematically concealed through intimidation and institutional indifference rather than representing actual reduction in assault frequency, Celine added, with acknowledgement that statistical improvement reflected enhanced documentation rather than sudden behavioral change among those whose predatory inclinations required ongoing vigilance rather than assuming that policy modification alone could eliminate character problems requiring individual accountability. Educational programs for junior personnel emphasize both rights awareness and practical self-defense techniques that personal safety might require when institutional protection proves inadequate. She continued with reference to training initiatives that empowered potential victims while maintaining focus upon perpetrator responsibility rather than placing burden of prevention upon those whose vulnerability should warrant protection rather than requiring defensive capability. Programs that include supernatural heritage identification for those whose bloodline might grant access to oceanic forces during emergency circumstances, Kira added, with reference to genealogical research that comprehensive policy revision had mandated through recognition that concealed capabilities created both opportunity and obligation, that proper education should address through training rather than leaving individuals unprepared for powers that crisis might activate. Identification that enables appropriate magical education rather than forcing individuals to discover capabilities through traumatic circumstances that emergency activation typically requires. Celine agreed with appreciation for systematic approach that prevented repetition of her own experience through proactive preparation rather than reactive response to crisis. That supernatural revelation, had created without adequate understanding or support. The afternoon brought visit from King Nerion, whose continued personal attention to institutional reform demonstrated royal commitment to comprehensive change, rather than symbolic gesture that might have satisfied public concern, without addressing underlying problems that systematic abuse had revealed through individual case whose supernatural implications had provided catalyst for broader recognition of institutional inadequacy. Quarterly reports indicate sustained improvement in personnel safety, alongside increased cooperation with investigation procedures that enhanced accountability, has encouraged through recognition that truthful testimony receives protection rather than retaliation, the Sea King announced, with evidence that policy implementation had achieved practical results through culture change that made reporting safer, while ensuring appropriate response to verified complaints. Enhanced cooperation that reflects growing confidence in institutional integrity, rather than previous assumption that complaints would be dismissed or create additional problems for those seeking justice through official channels. Celine replied, with assessment that institutional reform had succeeded in rebuilding trust, that systematic failures had destroyed through demonstrated indifference to individual welfare despite theoretical commitment to protection and justice. Your role as justice advocate has proven essential for bridging gap between formal authority and community experience through perspective that background provides alongside supernatural capabilities that crisis circumstances revealed. King Nerion observed with recognition that institutional position served authentic purpose, rather than ceremonial function, that symbolic appointment might have aided without practical effect upon policy implementation. Though I hope future advocates will receive proper preparation rather than discovering capabilities through trauma that emergency circumstances forced upon unprepared individual, she replied, with acknowledgement that comprehensive reform should prevent repetition of crisis discovery, while ensuring that those with supernatural heritage received education that enabled conscious development of Powie. There's that bloodline inheritance provided. Education that genealogical research has identified 37 individuals whose ancestry suggests potential for oceanic force connection, despite previous ignorance about capabilities that concealment had prevented from development. The Sea King continued with reference to systematic identification that comprehensive policy had initiated, through recognition that hidden heritage created both opportunity and vulnerability that proper training could address. Research that enables proactive education, rather than waiting for crisis circumstances to reveal powers that emergency activation typically requires through traumatic experience. Celine added with satisfaction that institutional learning had created systematic response to supernatural heritage that prevented future individuals from experiencing isolation and confusion, that discovery through Alt had created for her own development. Furthermore, King Nerion announced with decision that reflected comprehensive commitment to justice, rather than minimum response that public pressure might have accepted. Investigation has revealed that assault patterns extended beyond individual case toward systematic abuse that affected multiple victims, whose complaints had been systematically suppressed through intimidation and institutional indifference that required criminal prosecution rather than administrative discipline. Prosecution that acknowledges broader pattern of behavior, rather than treating individual incident as isolated exception, that personal character defect might explain without addressing institutional failures that enabled repeated abuse through protection of perpetrators and dismissal of victim testimony. She replied with appreciation for comprehensive approach that recognized systematic rather than individual problems requiring extensive reform. Justice that includes recognition of supernatural response as legitimate protection rather than vigilante violence, that legal system should condemn despite effective intervention, that institutional failure had made necessary. He continued with legal interpretation that acknowledged oceanic force intervention as appropriate response to circumstances that formal protection had failed to address through established procedures. Recognition that establishes precedent for future cases where supernatural intervention might prove necessary when institutional safeguards fail those whose heritage grants access to oceanic forces through bloodline connection that emergency circumstances activate. Celine observed with understanding that legal framework now accommodated supernatural protection, rather than treating such intervention as criminal activity requiring prosecution. Precedent balanced against requirement that such powers receive proper education and oversight to ensure that supernatural response serves justice rather than personal vengeance when circumstances trigger oceanic force activation. King Nerion added with framework that recognized both legitimate protection and need for responsible development of capabilities that bloodline inheritance provided. As evening approached with illumination that living architecture provided through harmonic resonance that created beauty alongside functionality, conversation turned toward personal recognition that institutional service had provided despite transformation from anonymous individual into public figure, whose responsibilities required constant attention to collective welfare, rather than purely null concerns. 6 months ago, survival seemed impossible beyond immediate crisis that assault had created. Celine reflected with perspective that time had provided for understanding transformation, that supernatural revelation had initiated through discovery of capabilities that bloodline heritage had concealed, despite relevance for personal identity and social responsibility. Survival that oceanic forces ensured through protective intervention that distinguished between those deserving assistance and those whose behavior warranted punishment according to moral judgment that elemental cooperation had provided, King Nerion replied, with acknowledgement of supernatural protection that had preserved individual life while revealing institutional failures requiring comprehensive response. Protection that transformed personal trauma into catalyst for broader reform that benefits all citizens through enhanced safety protocols, and victim advocacy that systematic change has established. She continued, with recognition that individual suffering had served collective improvement through institutional recognition of problems that individual case had revealed despite personal cost that public visibility had created. Service that demonstrates how individual conscience can challenge collective authority through authentic commitment to principles that honor both personal dignity and social responsibility. He concluded with assessment that institutional role had achieved balance between personal fulfillment and public welfare through dedication to justice that served authentic rather than political purposes. The quiet mermaid who had learned survival through invisibility had discovered that some pain demanded witness from highest authority, while revealing that oceanic justice included supernatural forces ready to protect those whose suffering activated powers that bloodline heritage provided for purposes extending beyond personal survival toward broader protection of vulnerable populations, whose voice, as institutional reform, had committed to hearing and honoring through systematic change that challenged every assumption about appropriate relationship between individual welfare and collective security. In chambers where royal authority and supernatural capability worked together for institutional reform that honored both individual dignity and social stability, their partnership demonstrated that authentic justice required attention to personal suffering alongside systematic change that prevented future victims from experiencing isolation and abandonment. That formal protection had failed to prevent through policies whose implementation now reflected understanding that individual pain often revealed collective failure, requiring comprehensive response through recognition that all citizens deserved protection, that institutional design claimed to provide, but which practice needed to honor through consistent attention to vulnerable populations whose welfare measured authentic success of governmental commitment to principles that oceanic civilization proclaimed through treaties and laws, whose meaning required demonstration through behavior rather than mere proclamation of theoretical ideals. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.